Welcome to PTI, boys and girls. I am Sam Mulberry, and I am joined by
Gehrz.
Chris, this is our last webisode.
It is. And Amy's not even here, so she's done.
What a crazy ride it has been.
Yeah, we'll talk more about that.
All right. There has been lots of debate in recent years about the Enlightenment. Should we celebrate the Age of Reason?
Yeah, so there are a couple of examples of this recently. I wanted to kind of run by you, so I'll deflect this back to you in a way. So the first one is, have you heard about the George Washington mural out? I think it's in Berkeley, California. So there's a high school called George Washington High School, and there's this series of murals around the high school depicting the life of the founding father, right? And it's controversial because it has images of enslaved African Americans toiling in the fields. There's an image of, I think, Washington's like surveying the frontier and literally stepping over a dead Native American. And so there's a debate now about, I mean, from Native Americans, African Americans, saying, why should we have to go to school around those images? What's interesting is that they were actually part of a Works Progress administration project during the Great Depression, and the artist was a communist who intentionally wanted to incorporate some of the
Sure, I mean, those were critiques, yeah.
So anyway, there's a big debate about what do you do with things like that, but what it made me think about is this kind of tension in the Enlightenment. You know, we haven't talked a lot about Washington, but generally if we put in the founding fathers of America, yeah, they are worthy of celebration, right? In that they're moving us closer towards liberty and equality and pursuit of happiness and all the rest. But at the same time, they are, for the most part, slave owners. They're patriarchal. They're part of an empire. I mean, Western civilization is not just an idea. It's also an empire built on blood and exploitation. And so I hope that came across really clearly as we got to the end of Unit 3, that the Enlightenment has significant tension between these ideas of liberation and equality and the actual practice on the ground, which for certain groups is hugely harmful and anything but free and equal, right, and liberating.
And how much of that, as a historian, how much of that is connected to the fact that we still don't have enough distance from the Enlightenment, and we're still living in a world which is contesting with, are we still in the modern age?
Right, it's hard to look back at something that's still, in a sense, unfolding. I mean,
because we can do the Middle Ages and not have that same feeling.
Well, and think about, I mean, in a sense, we talked about this with the Middle Ages, like no one would call it the Middle Ages thing because you were in the middle of it. We're in the middle, I would say, still of the Enlightenment being worked out. And so that's my second thought is, do you know who Steven Pinker is?
I do not.
Okay, so he is I think he's like a cognitive scientist, psychologist at Harvard.
Okay.
And he's written several books, but one of his books recently was basically extolling the virtues of the Enlightenment and suggesting we have turned a corner in human history in which we have overcome superstition with reason. Violence, he argues, controversially, has been on the decline since the 18th century, if you look at the whole sweep of time. And I mean, his argument is that we have to live into our Enlightenment heritage, and if we would, you know, kind of cast off the last things that Kant would say are holding us back, I mean, that would be the future of humanity. And this has been a hotly debated thesis, partly because his use of data on, like, you know, his violence actually declined. What do you do with, say, the 20th century?
Right,
Our students just started to explore with the World War I exhibit. But it did make me think, one way or another, we're still in the Enlightenment, right? If you've got people saying that we need to just kind of live more fully into it, we've not yet moved out of modernity into post-modernity quite yet. And I think we'll see this as we get to food chain and talk about some of these figures. Like they really have made the world that we know, right? And so I don't feel like we do have distance from all of this quite yet. And yeah, so I mean, that's just some of the thoughts swirling around my mind. As we come to the end of Unit 3, as we come to the end of CWC, like it's a story that we're kind of cutting off in the middle.
Well,
which is always what you do in a history.
Yeah, and I mean, I think about the question I ask, you know, should we celebrate the Age of Reason? Well, celebrate's always going to be tougher the more you know about something, right?
Yeah. So I mean, I think in many ways, yes, and we'll see that as we get to food chain and talk about some of what the people accomplish, but
certainly
to be determined still. Sam, one thing that's distinctive about teaching the summer version of this course, I mean, at least from when we started doing it, is we decided to go past the year 1800. So if you actually, students, I'm sure you read the Gen Ed curriculum regularly because you want to know what you're being educated in. CWC is actually charged charged with going up through the Enlightenment, which we just said continues today, but really like to 1800 or so. But back in the day, for a long time, CWC went well into the 20th century, did Industrial Revolution, did some of the key figures you met in the museum, talked about evangelicalism and fundamentalism in the 20th century. As someone whose career as a student and as a professor spans both sides of that, what were you most happy to see come back to CWC? Because we did decide to expand closer to our own time.
Yeah, I mean, there are certain topics that I really love, but the thing that I think, in terms of thinking about the narrative scope of the course, is actually some of the 19th into the early 20th century thinkers, Darwin, Marx, Nietzsche, Freud, because I think when we stop at like the peak of the Enlightenment, if we stop at 1800, it feels like reason has won to a certain degree, and we start to push at the edges in the face-to-face course, but we're only able to push at the edges a little bit. And the edges that we push at are the people who are critiquing the idea of the age of reason in one way. But when you look at Darwin, Nietzsche, Freud, Marx, they're pushing some of those Enlightenment rational ideas to their logical extents and critiquing it that way. And I think that stuff's really interesting.
Right, but also that they're different. I mean, some of them are really still heirs of the Enlightenment.
That's my point, yeah.
Some of them are not. Like
right.
Nietzsche, I would say, he is rejecting some of the core assumptions of Enlightenment.
Right, but he rejects it. To my understanding, he rejects it by pushing their ideas to their extreme and realizing you end up cutting off the branch you're standing on to a certain degree.
Well, that's true. Yeah. I would fully agree. And I'm not much of an intellectual historian. Neither of us is a philosopher, but especially like as you start thinking about what is the story of the course, like think about the bookend of, we really do start with Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Like we have Homer, we have the Democracy of Athens, but it's really those three philosophers. As we reach the end of the course, as you get especially, Marx, but Darwin, Freud, and Nietzsche, think about the story of the course in that sense. Like what is human reason, and what are its what's its potential, but also what are its limits? Is there such a thing as objective truth? Going
back to the question of what is the good life gets really interesting as you circle back. And what is goodness? What like those fundamental philosophical questions, you realize they continue to echo and remain as complicated as they ever were. That we don't come up with answers that we can keep holding fast to. So I always loved that part of the course because I find those thinkers fascinating and challenging, and they to another degree shape part of the world we're in. So we just talked about the fact that we're still in the Enlightenment, but another word, or in the modern era, we could say. Another word that you used though is postmodern, and so we're in this wrestling between, are we in modernity or are we in postmodernity? And even the name postmodernity is a sign that we don't know what it is. We know that it's not that, which goes back to Buber and homelessness and habitation. Nothing could be more homelessness than saying we are living in the era after the era that just passed. That's what homelessness is we don't know what it is. We just know we've started to reject that. So I think that stuff's really fascinating. All right, Chris. After teaching CWC, why do you like teaching L courses? So that's the next sort of step in the Gen Ed here at Bethel, right? So talk a little bit about L courses.
Yeah, I think it's worth spending a little time here just to remind students, you take the CWC course, that's a required course, and then from there you got this category. So it's called Contemporary Western Life and Thought. And I especially like that category because it helps you see that CWC is not this isolated, discrete experience that you finish/survive and then you're done. Right? In many ways, L is what picks up the story. It's really like the museum you just did on the 19th, early 20th century is the first half of most L courses in many ways. So I teach several of them. I teach a class on World War I, you just encountered, a class on World War II. I taught a couple others. The new one that I'm teaching with Chris Moore in political science is actually on the history and politics of sports, which is a very different way of getting at some of these themes. But basically what they all have in common is they're wrestling with this idea of modernity. Think about these pieces of mental furniture you encountered in the museum, this kind of inherent belief in progress inevitably rolling forward. That's Steven Pinker, right? Who's constantly climbing that hill. An individual dignity, equality, rights, in the primacy of science and applying that to technology. In different ways, all of these courses, whether you take with me or someone else, are getting at least some of those ideas and getting at ideas like individualism and what that does to community, which I know a lot of my students wrote about in the the Enlightenment Museum, because Dan Ritchie had highlighted some of that. So Sam, you've taught a couple of these with me. You took L courses yourself. I mean, how do you see connections between CWC and L courses?
I mean, I think it's exactly that. It's because I think of CWC so narratively. It's a natural picking up of not only those themes but of that story. So I think in a well-taught L course, you're going to hear those echoes. It is going to feel a little bit like that, even though if the course is nothing like CWC. And I would say, if we did our jobs right in this course, not only will you feel CWC in your L courses, but CWC will be an important component for thinking about the U course, which is why we have that as a co-rec, prereq. And I would say Christian theology. I love talking with the Christian theology professors about CWC, because what we're doing is kind of laying some track for them to really build some big things on. You don't build things on tracks, I just realized. We're laying some foundations for them to build some big things up. That's right. That's right.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think in many ways, like I teach G courses are kind of the next level from L and U, and so when I teach a class in the Cold War, we're talking about Marx, but we're really going back to talk about people like Smith and the Enlightenment. And in some ways, the Cold War is a war over what is the legacy of the Enlightenment. So I really do enjoy the fact that because I teach kind of at the ground floor of the Gen Ed curriculum, it's easy for me to see these connections pop up. And then students, I think, if you don't love CWC right now or you don't see its value, I think it becomes more clear, again, the more distance you get from it as you see some of these connections form. So Sam, this is one of the very last things students are doing is watching this and voting on food chain in just a moment. Other than that, what lies on the other side of this are two fairly big assignments. So let's start with the third exam. I feel like we've kind of talked to death advice about exams. Is there any last thing you want to reiterate, anything special about the third exam?
Yeah, I would say, and this just comes from grading the first two exams, I think sometimes students continue to feel that time crunch to the extent that there's one little thing that they're not doing that can really help your performance on the exam, which is make sure you read the questions really carefully. After you write, especially the essay, go back and read the question again and ask yourself, did I actually answer that? I will say, from exams that I graded, there were a number of people who did wonderfully on the essay. There were also a lot of people who, when I read their essay, I saw, I see what you're doing here, but you didn't actually touch on the question enough. Like your mind's read part of the question and pushed in a different direction. So read the question really, really, really carefully.
Yeah, I'd agree. Generally, my students did pretty well in the essays, but I would say, like, as a little insight to how we write these, we start with one of those questions in the study guide. Basically, we might tweak it, come at it from a different direction, but basically, we're going to take one of those questions, or maybe two of them, combine them. So if you know those, you should already have a broad sense of what to talk about. But then you do need to read those like bullet points underneath.
Absolutely.
Because we're always going to give you like, here are a couple of mastery terms you should think about. Or I mean, that's where you do need to kind of pause and not just jump to, I know what they're going for. Like read through those pretty carefully.
And those bullet points aren't the same as an outline for your essay, because if we think about the last one, the last bullet point said, make sure you talk about these figures. You don't have to talk about them at the end. No. You can weave them in, because that's actually going to tend to be a better answer.
They're just guidelines to help you shape your essay a little bit.
So the other big thing we have at the end of the course is our last assignment is what we call an exit interview.
I love this.
All right. Can you tell us a little bit about what to expect from that?
Well, let me tell you, first of all, why you should be excited about this. Because if you were in face-to-face CWC, you would also have like one last big thing, but it would be a longer single essay on something. And instead, we decided for summer to mix things up and give you 5 basically short essays. So each of these is going to be shorter than a response paper, more like 250 kind of words. And so you'll have 5 questions. You'll have actually until the Friday, so I think that's August 2nd, but you can start writing it as soon as the third exam is done. So you basically shouldn't feel much time crunch with this. At least one of the questions will stem directly from the last documentary film, so make sure you watch that, because you'll need to use that to answer one of the questions. But in general, that question, and especially the other 4, are let's wrap things up. Let's synthesize. Let's put some pieces together. Let's compare and contrast different units. We'll probably have a play version of a game or two that we've done here on the Webisode and ask you to rank, to evaluate significance, things like that. There'll be at least one. There'll be more of a personal reflection kind of essay. Like, you've actually been doing things like this the whole time. These should sound like familiar kinds of questions, because a lot of the response essays have been in this format. Once in a while in the museums, we'll ask you to kind of reflect on what's your own story story religiously? How does that connect with CWC? So those are the kind of questions to look for. Sam, any advice on how to approach this? I don't know if we ever find out from students how they do approach it.
Yeah, I mean, I would say with anything like this, lean towards the things that you felt drawn to. So like, if it's asking you for examples of a reading or something like that, think about what were the readings that somehow kind of resonated with you, and talk about those things. I mean, talk about the stuff you felt like you really understood well. Go back and look at some of the things you wrote for earlier essays. That can be a helpful place to go to kind of trigger your memory, especially if your answer is making you look back to the beginning of this course. I don't know if you remember all the way back in June when we were talking about the ancient Greek.
It's been a while.
Yeah, so I think that can be really helpful. Take your time on it. I mean, I actually think the best piece of advice I would give you is when you finish the test, open that up, read the questions, and don't start writing right away. Just let them stew for a while, go do something else, just have them running around in your head, and then you can sit down and write. This doesn't have to be something you have to try to power through.
Yeah, I think that's very good advice. And I actually think it's a really useful way to end the course, because it helps you step back and make meaning of what you've just been through. So it won't get at every single thing. It's not a comprehensive spew forth every bit of information you've learned, but it really is getting at the key outcomes of the course, the key themes. All the big questions are going to be touched on in one way or another. And you should come to that and kind of think, like, I'm kind of amazed how much we talked about and the complexity of some of the ideas, and how you're able to put this all together. I mean, the real outcome we're working on here is CWC is meant to help you write concisely about complicated ideas. And you've been doing this, again, with all the response papers, with exam essays, and this is your last chance to show it. And I would guess a lot of you came in pretty good at that. Some of you've really developed along the way, and the exit interview is your last chance to show that off. So that's coming up after the exam, but we do have an exam, so to help you prepare for that, we'll be back in just a moment to play one last game of Food Chain to go over some of the key terms of Unit 3. Okay, Sam, here we are. Food Chain, last chance. I have no idea who's won most
I've lost pretty much everything.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's continue
I need a W.
Let's reverse that trend as we go to Unit 3, Food Chain. So again, if you don't remember, this is your first time watching for some reason, what we do is we pull out, I think mostly mastery terms, basically, from the unit. One last chance to go over the significance of probably 8 to 10 of these terms we'll talk about, but also step back and think about what are the stories of the unit, and what are some key figures, what are some things we want to kind of go over one more time, and also feed our natural competitive fire.
That's right.
And the mutual loathing we have for each other as adversaries. Do you want to start, or should I start?
You go ahead.
Okay, so number 5 for me is going to be Mary Wollstonecraft. So, this is, I think, one of the terms where, in the moment, I don't know if anyone would have had Mary Wollstonecraft as one of the most important figures of the 18th century or the Enlightenment, but as we think about where's the story going forward from the year 1800, well, you saw a little bit of an exhibit about the suffrage movement in the 19th, early 20th century. We just talked about women entering politics in the first segment, or we're about to talk about women entering politics, I'm sorry.
Pull back the curtain.
In the third segment of the show. Yeah, we do it out of order, surprise. And so I think it is worth noting that this really is the founding mother / grandmother of feminism, someone who in her own time, a time when a very patriarchal society does not open doors to politics, economics, law, education, women, could see what a different future might look like. And I think that's worthy of putting on the list. She also can maybe stand in for some other people who are not a mastery term on this list. But I'm going to put Mary Wollstonecraft number 5 on my food chain.
Fantastic. I am going to start with Voltaire. And Voltaire is there for me, really, I was looking, as I was going through this, I was looking for a figure who sort of purely represented the Enlightenment. Mm-hmm. And I think, as I was looking at the list, he's actually a pretty good image of that, because he's not a scientist, right? Because even an Enlightenment era scientist to me feels a little bit like, well, they're just a child of Newton.
Yeah, exactly.
But Voltaire is somebody who's thinking about the Enlightenment and thinking about Enlightenment rationalism, thinking about natural laws and those types of things in religion, in more sort of social, societal type things. Particularly Voltaire, I have him here to represent deism. Yeah. I mean, if this is a course on Christianity and Western culture, the developments in religion are going to be really central. And I think deism is absolutely crucial to understand. In part, I always tell my students, when they struggle to understand, well, what is deism? I say it's sort of the default religion of America. Like if people sort of believe in God, but they don't really there's not really a lot of other stuff around it. It's probably this trickling down from the fact that America's largely founded by deists, right? And it grows, and America is born in this Enlightenment moment. And for Voltaire, deism is not just about sort of the scientific revolution spilling over into other areas of life, but it's also about a response to the wars of religion. It's also about global expansion and encountering other parts of the world where people have these, advanced civilizations that aren't based on Judeo-Christian ethics, and trying to think about, well, how do we wrestle with that, right? And so I think Voltaire is really a key figure to sort of stand in as the representative of the sort of the pure Enlightenment.
Well, I'm not going to say anything bad about adding more French history to this.
There you go.
So let's move on to number 4. And Sam's correct. I think in Christianity and Western culture, religious developments are important, even in the age of reason, even in an age of deism. I think it's important to note that you've still got figures like John Wesley who are important not just today because we have a Wesleyan tradition with Methodism, the Holiness movement. He's kind of a great-grandfather of Pentecostalism in some ways. But he's also a grandchild of the Reformation. And even in an age of reason, he's carrying forward some of those emphases. And he kind of stands in here for other revivalists, people like Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards, and in a sense for pietism. I think it's important that in the midst of this emphasis on skepticism, questioning of miracles, moving towards other sources of authority, you've got an Oxford-trained, brilliant man who believes deeply in the authority of Scripture alongside these other sources, who wants to bring about a revival, who believes in the supernatural, who also uses his office to preach against slavery, which is another important tension of the Enlightenment we've talked about. Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that I really like about how we end this course as we do the kind of tensions of the Enlightenment is this notion that it's an age of enlightenment, also an age of awakening, right? And that's probably not as important as some of the things we're going to get to, but a very important part of the story for a class on church history as well as Western Civ. So, John Wesley.
All right. My number 4 is a familiar face, so I won't say too much about Wollstonecraft. I did put her here to represent a lot of the things that you talked about, to represent critiques of the Enlightenment using the tools of the Enlightenment. I could have easily put Equiano here as well. I really wrestled with the two of those, and as you were talking about Wollstonecraft, I sort of thought, oh, I wish I had done Equiano instead. But I think they're there to me to represent the same type of thing. The fact that the Enlightenment is both this sort of powerful explanatory tool. Reason in the Enlightenment is this powerful explanatory tool, but it also is a tool that can be used to critique the Enlightenment itself. And I think, along with what you said, that's a powerful thing to attach to Wollstonecraft.
Yeah, and again, I think we could put other people in. I think we were both kind of astonished. We step back, look at our list of possibilities, and notice there's only one woman on there. We could very easily have added someone like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, the Pankhursts from the suffragist movement come in at this point, but we'll let her.
But lists like this are always about representing.
Yep, that's right. Okay, well, neither of us put Equiano on. Neither of us put someone from the 18th century abolitionist movement, so I'll put someone from the 19th century abolitionist movement. Now, if you've been paying attention to the webisodes, I've been reading David Blight's biography of Frederick Douglass, and Blight calls Douglass maybe the great American prophet. I mean, someone who very consciously is speaking as a Jeremiah, as an Ezekiel, as an Isaiah in his own time. And so I think it's really important because this is a figure of the Enlightenment too. Douglass is entirely self-taught, never goes to university, but he is very much a child of the Enlightenment. He reads a lot of the figures we're talking about. He believes deeply, especially in a natural rights tradition that someone like John Locke is giving us, that we are born, all humans, regardless of origin, regardless of skin color, nationality, religion, we have inherent rights. And maybe the chief job of government is protect those rights, starting with freedom, right, and life, and liberty, and not being treated as property. But Douglass also then believes deeply in private property, so he's a very Lockean figure. I think it's also important because it points attention not just to the Enlightenment, but of Western culture. The Western culture both is a liberating and enslaving force in so many ways. And I almost wanted to put De las Casas here to talk about the older stage of imperialism. I think Douglass is a nice example of how he has been victimized and traumatized by Western culture spreading and creating this nasty economy of slave trading, but also then using the tools of it to critique it, undo it, and at least start to make some headway towards civil rights.
All right.
Frederick Douglass is my number 3.
My number 3, another Frederick, Friedrich Nietzsche. This is where we put the Freds, right?
Do you think he had a German girlfriend? I didn't.
Douglas?
Yeah.
Okay, I wouldn't be surprised if Nietzsche had that.
Probably.
Right.
Yeah. It's one thing they have in common.
All right. I talked about Nietzsche in segment 1, so I won't say too much here, but the reason why I wanted Nietzsche on here is I wanted one representative of sort of a post-Enlightenment figure, or as I talked about in the first segment, this idea of someone taking the ideas of the Enlightenment and pushing them further and further. I mean, I remember when I was a student, Professor Paul Reasoner talked about the sort of development in the sort of history of human knowledge and human understanding, and how in the ancient world, like, you needed God or the gods to explain natural phenomena. By the time we get to the scientific revolution, all of a sudden we start to have more and more natural phenomena explained scientifically, to the point where you could say, even if we can't explain everything, we at least know we probably don't need God to explain every natural phenomenon. So that's where we get this deism, where God's sort of floating above and kind of tethered to the natural world. And Nietzsche is the logical extent of that, to say, well, if that's the world that we're living in, what if we just snip that cord?
Yeah.
Like, is this just an old, outdated idea that we're holding on to? And he's saying, well, what if we got rid of that idea? And he's saying we already have, we just haven't recognized it yet. And then could look honestly at the world around us and look honestly at what a human being is. I think he's a fascinating person in sort of the history of philosophy, the history, like intellectual history of the West. So I think he's paramount for understanding the 20th century in lots and lots of ways.
Yep. Well, I'll go with another person we mentioned in our kind of preview of this discussion, another 19th century figure, and talk about Karl Marx. I almost put Adam Smith here, partly because I feel like we always undersell the importance of economics. In many ways, living in 21st century America, we're still living in Adam Smith's world. But Marx is actually an heir of Smith. Now, what Marx is saying is actually that Smith is onto something, that there are these laws of economy running through how we produce stuff, how we consume stuff, how we set prices and wages and all of this. The difference is that Marx has seen this kind of go for a few more generations, seeing the damage that it's doing to societies, to workers' sense of who they are, what they do, and saying, well, what if we use the laws of capitalism against capitalism, right? And so Marx, in many ways, is, here's a theme, taking Enlightenment and using it against itself, taking modernity and using it against itself, and saying, well, yeah, but if we kind of let this go, we're going to get to the point where the working class would be so deeply alienated and so deeply marginalized, it will have no recourse but to revolt and create a new society, which itself is a kind of Enlightenment idea. That's that sense of progress, right? And it's a very bloody kind of progress in Marx's understanding, but this is the working out of the Enlightenment. I also want to mention it because there's so much talk about socialism in American political discourse right now, right? I mean, often it's a weapon against people, but I think there are some who are, kind of waking up to that idea. Now, Marx is one kind of socialism. There are all sorts of socialisms in the 19th century. Many of them are actually deeply Christian. I think it's worth kind of reacquainting ourselves with that notion that maybe the most important good is not private property or not individual opportunity. Maybe it's actually, how do we make a more equal society, including economic equality? And maybe that's something that we ought to think a little bit more about, not just saying, well, the Cold War is done, Marx is dead.
For my number two, actually for my number one and my number two, if these were sort of representative of the Enlightenment, of one particular critique of the Enlightenment, sort of its limitations, its marginalizations, Nietzsche is pushing the sort of full extent of the Enlightenment. My last two, I just thought, if we're thinking about the most significant figures, these are two people who fundamentally shape the world we live in today, the modern world. So, John Locke. I mean, we talk about John Locke in terms of natural rights. We talk about John Locke in terms of sort of his idea about political authority. Unbelievably important. I know some of my students struggled with this when they were trying to understand Locke. I mean, one of the big important things that we get from Locke is a rational justification for political revolution, which didn't really exist before. I mean, if you look at a medieval person or even Luther talking about political authority, right? It is this thing which comes from God, right? So it's sacred. And Locke oddly is saying, well, the thing government isn't is sacred. It's this thing that we create, and if we create it, means we can improve it and make it better and tear it down if we need to. And this is so much shaped, especially as Americans, it so much shapes our understanding of our relationship to the government. Not to mention things like natural rights, and because natural rights ties into the question about what does it mean to be a human being, right? And we see this when we're talking about Wollstonecraft and Douglas and these types of things. Locke is a major figure in terms of thinking about, what does it mean to be a human being?
Yeah, I almost wanted to say vote for Sam's list because you thought to talk about Locke, and I did not make room for Locke. And and certainly in politics, we are living in Locke's world, even here in the 20th century. But above all else,
maybe this makes you beat me, though. You have Newton number one.
We'll see what you put number one. We are living in Isaac Newton's world. So you and Amy talked about this, I think, on the last webisode. Is Newton actually the most important or second most important person in the course?
She played the Jesus card, so I got crushed.
Yeah, that's impossible. I am going to say, like, everything else we're talking about here is building an Isaac Newton. I just don't think we can understand how powerful this notion of, because we understand laws of nature, and they're universal, and they're comprehensible, accessible to reason, they're reproducible, they're regular, and they can be harnessed. Once you have that, I mean, people really feel like they have read the mind of God as a result. And once you do that with astronomy or physics, right? Why can't you do that with the human body? Why can't you do that with the nature of the earth as a physical substance, with the elements that the earth is made out of? But then especially, why can't you do that with politics? Why can't you do that with economics? Why can't you do that with religion, right? Like anything, education. I mean, what we're doing right here is all resting on the bedrock of Newton's notion of laws of nature. And this becomes a major challenge then to Christianity, right? Do we embrace the notion of God as just this watchmaker kind of tethered above who can be snipped away? Or does it push us then to kind of think about, well, how do we incorporate the authority of Scripture alongside reason and personal experience? And this, in many ways, that really is what your L course is going to be about in some way. Like, how much do we continue to live in this universe that Newton has founded? And then if you take physics classes, Einstein comes along and overturns everything, but we're not a physics course.
Right. So, like I said, Newton makes your list pretty strong.
I win.
You have to see what I have at number one.
No way can I beat a what?
Isaac Newton. And I won't repeat everything you said. I won't belabor it. I mean, Newton sets the table for Unit 3, right? Yeah. Unit 3 is understood through the lens of Newton, which means that what he really represents is something which is deeply rare, which is a true paradigm shift.
Yes.
Which is the way we interpret the world is fundamentally different post-Newton. To the extent that this is why when you study the Middle Ages, you feel like, I can't really get myself in the heads of these people. It's because of him. Yep. So when we study the ancient world, you can't really get your head around Pericles and how he understands the world, or Plato and how he understands the world, because Newton fundamentally shaped, whether you're a Christian or not, fundamentally shaped the way in the West and in beyond the West we think about the world. This has powerful explanatory power.
It does. Well, we'll see what happens.
I want to win one of these.
It's up to the people, but because of this, I think you probably ought to vote for Sam. Okay, well, hopefully this was helpful as it prepares you for the last exam. We'll be right back just to wrap things up on our final episode of the summer of 2019.
It's happy time. Chris, happy birthday to Jacinda Ardern. Do you know who she is?
I believe she's the Prime Minister of New Zealand.
That's right. She turns 39 today.
Amazing.
Yes.
I feel like such a slacker.
And you feel old too?
Yeah.
All right, Chris, what are the chances that the United States will elect a woman as president in the next 10 years?
So this is also the anniversary of Hillary Clinton's nomination in 2016 at the Democratic National Convention. We know how that turned out. I would say, if we're talking 10 years, so this
you have two elections, right?
2 elections, right? I mean, I was just talking with one of our political science friends. His sense was right now, odds are that Donald Trump is reelected. So if we start there, I don't think it's going to happen. It's not even clear a woman would get the Democratic nomination. I would say 1 in 3, though.
Okay.
Because I think one thing that has become very clear from the Democratic race so far is there's some really very strong women candidates, whether it's Elizabeth Warren or Kamala Harris, Amy Klobuchar, even our very own. So I mean, I think it's becoming less and less unusual that at least in that party, there's a pretty deep bench of women who can run. And I think Hillary Clinton did get the majority of the popular vote. I think it's, but at the same time, it would be groundbreaking. So I'll say 1 in 3.
All right.
Okay, Sam, happy anniversary too. One more moon thing. Apollo 15, which launched this day in 1971. Trivia time, Sam.
I do love trivia.
I know you do. How many times did Americans land on the moon after Apollo 15?
So 1971 was Apollo 15.
That's correct.
Okay. And I know by the time we get to the 80s, we're not going to the moon anymore.
Not even close.
I know it's around that. I'm going to say we never went back after that.
We did go back.
We did,
but not for much more. So it was 2 times, Apollo 16 and 17, but 1972 was the last time we set foot on the moon.
Wow,
do you
we're
know what
due.
We are due. It's before our lives.
That's right.
Which tells you how long it's actually been. Do you know what Apollo 15 is famous for?
I do. Is that the lunar module? or not the module, the lunar rover.
The rover.
Rover, yeah. So this is when they could drive around. It's a great Jerry Seinfeld bit about the lunar rover.
And that is it for space history. It was a very special summer for
All right, we'll do a podcast about it maybe. Happy trails, Chris, to Summer CWC. When we write the history of CWC,
which is one of your favorite phrases.
That's right. What will this summer be remembered for?
Well, space history, apparently. But I want to say it's for this beard. Probably is what's going to go down.
Is this your first Summer CWC beard?
I don't know. It might be. I've done it more. I've only done this like 3 times in my life. Usually it's been a J-term kind of thing because I convinced myself that it keeps me warm on those frigid January days. So this is odd to have a beard in the summer. I do this though as kind of a tribute to the founding fathers of CWC. Like if we could, I don't know if we can put up a picture right now of the famous 4 professors who did it. You'll see facial hair was a big part of the at least early generation of professors, and it kind of went away, and I feel like we're bringing it back just a little bit.
See, I think we missed an opportunity here because I wasn't really thinking about the beard. We could have done something where if you had lost, you had to like have a mustache for one webisode, because then it would be captured on the internet. Oh, we missed it.
I did this once because the fun thing about doing a beard, even a terrible beard like this, is you get to then gradually take off pieces of it.
You can go Civil War. You can do
the mutton chop thing, do the Fu Manchu thing. It's a fun thing to do. And then I showed my wife what the mustache thing looks like, and she didn't talk to me for like a week. It was kind of disturbing, actually. I looked like I belong on Dateline NBC. So we will not be doing that deal now or in the future. Sam, it's been a fun ride. I hope it's clear we like doing these webisodes a lot. It's as close to actual like teaching people as we can get. So it's been fun to do this with you.
It has.
Any last thoughts?
You know, there's no more museums left, but you should still allow Flash.
Always.